A diesel engine does not need a spark to run. That single fact is the very thing that makes a diesel engine reliable, durable, most trusted engine ever built. But it's also the reason it can turn on you in a way no gasoline engine ever could. Because when a diesel starts feeding on something it was never supposed to burn, there is no switch to flip that will make it stop. The engine just keeps accelerating and screaming towards self-destruction. And the only thing standing between you and a catastrophe is whether you understand what's happening fast enough to choke off the air before the whole thing tears itself apart. That's called a runaway. And in some of the worst industrial disasters of the last 50 years, a runaway diesel wasn't just the machine that failed, it was the spark that set the world on fire. To understand why this happens, and why it terrified everyone from long-haul truckers to offshore drilling crews, you first have to understand what makes a diesel engine fundamentally different from every other engine on the road. And it starts with a man named Rudolf Diesel, who in the 1890s had an idea so dangerous that it nearly killed him before he could prove it worked. Here's the thing about how a gasoline engine operates. It draws in a mixture of fuel and air, compresses it, and then a spark plug fires to ignite that mixture. Turn off the ignition and the spark stops. Combustion stops and the engine dies. It's simple, clean, and controllable. A gasoline engine lives and dies by that spark. If there's no spark, there's no power. The driver is always in command because electricity is always the gatekeeper. Rudolf Diesel looked at that system and saw waste, enormous, staggering waste. Steam engines of his era converted maybe 6 to 10% of their fuel's energy into actual work. Gasoline engines weren't much better. Diesel believed he could do dramatically more by eliminating the spark entirely. His idea was radical. Compress air inside a cylinder so violently, squeeze it so hard, that the air itself gets hot enough to ignite fuel on contact. No spark plug needed. No ignition system at all. Just physics. You crush the air until it reaches temperatures above 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Then you inject fuel directly into that furnace, and combustion happens all by itself. He filed his first patent in 1892. The early prototypes nearly killed him when one of the test cylinders exploded. He spent time in a hospital, struggled with his eyesight and his health, and kept working. By 1897, he had a functioning engine, and it was everything he'd promised. More efficient, more powerful per unit of fuel, simpler in some ways because there was no electrical ignition system to fail. The engine ran on compression alone, and that, right there, is the seed of the runaway problem. Because Rudolf Diesel built an engine that doesn't need permission to burn. It doesn't wait for a spark. If fuel gets into that cylinder and there's compressed air hot enough to light it, combustion happens, whether anyone asks for it or not. A gasoline engine has a gatekeeper. A diesel engine has an open door. Now, under normal operation, this isn't a problem. Modern diesel engines meter their fuel with extraordinary precision. The injection system delivers exactly the right amount of diesel into the cylinder at exactly the right moment. The governor controls engine speed by adjusting how much fuel gets injected per stroke. More fuel means more power and higher RPM. Less fuel means the engine slows down. Cut the fuel entirely and the engine stops. The driver turns the key, the fuel supply shuts off, the engine dies. That's how it's supposed to work. And for the vast majority of the millions of diesel engines running right now around the world, that's exactly how it does work. But here's the catch. A diesel engine doesn't care what it burns. Diesel fuel, motor oil, gasoline vapor, even coal dust. If it's combustible and it reaches that superheated air inside the cylinder, the engine will burn it. And this is where things go wrong. Because if some unintended fuel source starts leaking into the combustion chamber, like oil seeping past a worn turbocharger seal, blow-by gases pushing crankcase oil mist into the intake, or flammable vapor drifting in from the surrounding environment, the engine suddenly has a fuel supply that nobody is controlling. The governor responds to the extra power by cutting back on the injected diesel, trying to maintain the set speed. But the engine doesn't slow down because the uncontrolled fuel is still coming, so the governor cuts diesel fuel further. Eventually, it cuts it off completely, and the engine keeps running because it doesn't need the fuel you're giving it anymore. It found its own. This is the moment a diesel becomes a runaway. The engine is now feeding itself from a source that has no shutoff valve, no metering system, no governor control. And the physics of the situation create a vicious feedback loop, especially in turbocharged engines. As RPM climbs, the turbocharger spins faster. A faster turbocharger forces more air into the cylinders. More air means more oxygen for combustion. More oxygen means the uncontrolled fuel burns more completely and more violently. That produces more exhaust energy, which spins the turbo even faster, which pushes even more air in. The engine isn't just accelerating, it's accelerating its own acceleration. Each revolution makes the next one worse. The driver hears it first, a sudden, sickening rise in engine note. The tachometer needle sweeping toward the red and past it. Thick clouds of smoke pouring from the exhaust. Sometimes black, sometimes white, sometimes blue, depending on what the engine is burning. The whole vehicle shakes. The sound climbs to a scream that anyone who's heard it never forgets. And here's the part that sends a chill through every diesel operator who understands what's happening. You turn the key off and nothing changes. You pull the key out of the ignition and the engine doesn't care. It doesn't even notice because you just cut off the fuel supply it already stopped using 2 minutes ago. Think about that for a moment. You're sitting behind the wheel of a vehicle with an engine that is destroying itself. The RPM climbing toward mechanical limits. The engine was never designed to hit. And the one thing every driver's instinct screams to do, to turn it off, is the one thing that doesn't work. Mechanics who've dealt with runaways describe a specific kind of terror. Not the sharp, adrenalized fear of a sudden crash, but a slower, more helpless kind. The realization that the machine has slipped your control and there's no obvious way to get it back. The engine temperatures are spiking. The oil is being consumed as fuel instead of being used for lubrication. Bearings are running dry. Connecting rods are flexing under forces they were never designed for. Valves are bouncing off their seats. If the engine doesn't come apart from the mechanical stress, it can overheat to the point where glowing metal becomes its own ignition source. And in environments where flammable vapors are present, oil fields, refineries, chemical plants, a runaway diesel doesn't just destroy itself, it becomes a torch. So how do you stop one? There's only one reliable answer, and it has nothing to do with fuel. You have to cut off the air. A diesel engine needs 2 things to run: fuel and air. If the fuel supply is uncontrollable, air is the only thing left to take away. In theory, this sounds simple. In practice, it's anything but. Someone has to get close enough to the screaming, shaking engine to physically block the air intake. Old-timers will tell you about guys shoving rags into the intake, clamping their hands over the opening, or hitting it with a carbon dioxide fire extinguisher to displace the oxygen. Every one of those methods requires a person to stand next to an engine that could throw a connecting rod through the block at any second. If the vehicle has a manual transmission, there's one other option, and it's an act of desperation. You put the truck in the highest gear, hold the brakes down as hard as you can, and dump the clutch. The idea is that the load of trying to move a stationary vehicle in high gear exceeds the torque the engine can produce, and it stalls. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it destroys the transmission, the clutch, and the flywheel in the process. But if the alternative is a catastrophic engine failure with shrapnel and fire, a wrecked gearbox starts to look like a bargain. Mechanics who've had to make that call will tell you it's not a decision you think through. It's a reflex, born out of knowing there's nothing else left to try. There's a reason the industry eventually developed automatic positive air shutoff valves, devices mounted in the intake that can slam shut when they detect an overspeed condition. But for decades, and on plenty of equipment still running today, that technology either wasn't installed or wasn't required. If you've ever owned a high-mileage turbo diesel pickup, you might have a sense of how this starts. The turbocharger on a diesel engine is lubricated by engine oil under pressure. That oil is fed through seals designed to keep it inside the turbo housing. But seals wear. Miles, heat cycles, and vibration take their toll. When a turbo seal starts to fail, it doesn't fail all at once. A small amount of oil mist begins getting pulled into the intake side of the turbocharger, drawn in by the same suction that pulls in combustion air. At first, the amount is tiny. You might notice a faint blue haze in the exhaust, maybe a slight oily film around the intake piping. These are the warning signs, and they're easy to ignore because the engine still runs fine. But that trickle can become a flood. One day the seal gives way a little more, the oil flow increases past the point where the engine's normal fuel metering can compensate, and you've got a runaway. Drivers who've been through it on the highway describe a particular kind of disbelief. You're cruising at 65, the engine's been humming along for 300,000 miles, and suddenly the RPM gauge starts climbing on its own. Your foot isn't on the throttle. The truck is accelerating and you're not asking it to. The exhaust behind you turns into a smoke screen so thick that cars start swerving out of the way. And the noise, it's not the normal diesel rumble anymore. It's a high-pitched mechanical wail that every instinct tells you is the sound of something tearing itself apart from the inside. The other common internal cause is blow-by. In any piston engine, a small amount of combustion gas leaks past the piston rings and pressurizes the crankcase. That's normal. Every engine does it. But in a worn engine, one with hundreds of thousands of miles on it, one that's been run hard in dust and heat, the piston rings lose their seal. Blow-by increases. The crankcase fills with pressurized oil mist that has to go somewhere. In most engines, it gets routed back through a crankcase ventilation system and into the intake to be burned. Under normal conditions, the amount is so small it doesn't affect engine speed. But in a badly worn engine, the blow-by can become heavy enough that the crankcase is pushing a significant volume of oil vapor into the intake. The engine starts feeding on its own lifeblood. These internal causes account for most runaway events on the road. A trucker running a high-mileage rig. A farmer with an old tractor that hasn't seen the inside of a shop in years. A construction crew running a generator that's been neglected. The common thread is always the same: worn seals, deferred maintenance, and an engine that found fuel where none was supposed to be. But the runaways that killed people, the ones that made headlines and changed regulations, those mostly came from outside the engine. And they happened in the places where diesel engines work alongside the most dangerous substances on Earth. In oil and gas operations, diesel engines are everywhere. They power the drilling rigs, they drive the generators, they run the pumps, the compressors, the light towers, the trucks. And all of that equipment operates in close proximity to hydrocarbons: natural gas, methane, propane, gasoline vapor, hydrogen sulfide. Under normal operations, the air is clean, and the engines run as designed, but leaks happen, blowouts happen, spills happen. And when flammable gas or vapor gets into the air around a running diesel engine, that engine's intake system sucks it right in alongside the combustion air. The engine doesn't know the difference between clean air and air saturated with methane. It just compresses whatever comes in. And if there's enough hydrocarbon in that mix to sustain combustion, the engine starts running on it. The speed of this transformation is one of the most frightening things about it. Industry studies have documented that even low concentrations of flammable gas entering the intake can trigger a runaway in as little as 3 to 12 seconds. There is almost no reaction time. A gas leak opens on a drilling platform. The wind carries the vapor toward an idling generator. The generator's intake gulps it in, and within seconds, the engine is screaming past its governed speed, climbing toward destruction, and every revolution is now functioning as a potential ignition source for the very vapor cloud that caused the runaway in the first place. The engine doesn't just fail, it becomes the detonator. On January 13th, 2003, at a waste disposal facility near Rocheron, Texas, 2 vacuum trucks were unloading oil-filled waste liquids into an open collection pit. The waste material was more volatile than anyone realized. A flammable vapor cloud formed around the trucks. Both trucks had their diesel engines idling. The vapor got sucked into the air intakes, and at least one of the engines went into runaway. Witnesses heard the engines begin racing violently. Then one of them backfired. The flash ignited the vapor cloud. 2 workers standing near the trucks were killed instantly. 3 others suffered severe burns. One of those 3 died weeks later from his injuries. The U.S. Chemical Safety Board investigated and found that the idling diesel engines, ingesting the vapor and going into overspeed, had provided the ignition source for the explosion. 2 years later, on March 23, 2005, came the disaster that put diesel runaway into the national consciousness. At the BP oil refinery in Texas City, Texas, a startup procedure on an isomerization unit went catastrophically wrong. A distillation tower was overfilled due to faulty instrumentation, insufficient alarms, and procedural failures that had been building for years under a corporate culture of cost-cutting and deferred maintenance. Hot liquid hydrocarbons shot out of an atmospheric vent stack like a geyser, raining down and forming a massive vapor cloud across the refinery grounds. A diesel pickup truck had been left idling roughly 25 feet from that vent stack. Nobody thought twice about it. Trucks idled on refinery grounds all the time. But when the vapor cloud reached that truck, the hydrocarbon fumes were drawn into the engine's air intake. The diesel engine started racing. Witnesses saw the truck catch fire. The engine's runaway condition generated enough heat to ignite the surrounding vapor cloud. The resulting explosion killed 15 workers. 180 others were injured. The blast shattered windows 3/4 of a mile away. Property damage reached $200 million, and total costs, including settlements, exceeded $2 billion. Every one of the 15 dead were contractors working in temporary office trailers that BP had placed dangerously close to the process unit. The disaster was caused by a cascade of failures: organizational, procedural, mechanical. But the ignition source, the final link in the chain, was a runaway diesel engine in an idling pickup truck. 5 years after Texas City, on April 20th, 2010, the Deepwater Horizon drilling rig exploded in the Gulf of Mexico, killing 11 workers and triggering the worst accidental marine oil spill in history. The chain of events began with a well blowout that sent a massive column of methane gas shooting up through the drill pipe and onto the rig. Investigation reports identified the diesel-powered generators in the engine room as a likely ignition source. As the methane entered the air intake systems of the rig's massive diesel generators, at least one engine went into overspeed. The chief electrician aboard the rig later testified that in a runaway scenario, the engine would just keep running until it blew up. Safety shutoff devices that were supposed to protect against exactly this kind of event failed to function. The rig's chief mechanic confirmed under questioning that the overspeed safety devices had not worked properly. These weren't isolated incidents. They were the most visible points on a timeline that stretches back decades. In 2008, 3 workers were killed in Greeley, Colorado, when a truck sparked an explosion at an oil tank. That same year, 1 worker died in Bristow, Oklahoma, when a truck ignited a gas well. In 2011, a truck driver in North Dakota was seriously burned when his own truck went into runaway, while transferring oily salt water into a flowback tank. In 2014, OSHA reported 3 workers killed and 2 hospitalized when an explosion during hydraulic fracturing operations was traced to the runaway of a diesel-powered light tower parked just 12 feet from the wellhead. The pattern was always the same: a diesel engine, idling or running under load, in proximity to flammable vapors. A leak, a spill, a release. The vapor reaches the intake, and in seconds, the machine that was supposed to be a tool becomes a weapon. The industry knew about this failure mode for a long time before the worst disasters happened. As far back as 1984, the American Petroleum Institute issued recommendations suggesting that refineries consider equipping diesel vehicles with rapid shutoff valves on their air intakes. In 1985, Saskatchewan's oil and gas regulations began requiring air intake shutoff valves on diesel engines operating within 75 feet of a wellhead. Other Canadian provinces followed. By 1989, U.S. federal regulations required automatic shutoff devices on unattended diesel engines on offshore installations in the Gulf of Mexico. The technology existed, the knowledge existed. The regulations existed in some jurisdictions, but not in others, and enforcement was inconsistent. What makes this story so frustrating to the people who lived through it is that the fix was never complicated, and it never required some breakthrough in engineering or some expensive new technology. A positive air shutoff valve is a relatively simple device: a butterfly valve or a guillotine-style gate mounted in the engine's air intake piping, held open during normal operation, designed to snap shut and seal the intake when it detects an overspeed condition. Some versions are automatic, using sensors that monitor RPM or intake airflow and trigger the shutoff without any human intervention. Others are manual, requiring the operator to pull a cable or flip a switch. The automatic versions can stop a runaway in seconds. They've been commercially available since the 1950s. They don't cost much relative to the value of the equipment they protect or the lives at stake. And yet, for decades, they weren't universally required. Trucks entered refineries and well sites without them. Generators ran on drilling platforms without them. The regulations caught up slowly, country by country, always a few years behind the latest catastrophe. Canada moved faster than the United States. By 2016, Transport Canada required automatic shutoff valves on all trucks carrying hazardous cargo. In the US, requirements varied by state, by industry, and by the specific interpretation of OSHA guidelines that individual inspectors chose to enforce. If you've ever worked around diesel equipment in the oil patch, or in a refinery, or on a drilling rig, you probably have your own version of this story. Maybe you were the one who heard the engine start climbing and knew immediately what was happening. That's the thing about a runaway diesel that sticks with people long after the event. It's not just the mechanical violence, though that's real enough. It's the betrayal. The diesel engine is supposed to be the dependable one, the one that starts in the cold and runs all day and doesn't need to be coddled, the one that truckers build their livelihoods around and operators trust with their safety. When that engine turns on you, when it starts feeding on something you never gave it and refuses to stop, it shakes a kind of faith that runs deeper than specifications. You trusted this machine, and the very quality that made it trustworthy, its willingness to burn almost anything, to ignite fuel without permission, to keep running when other engines would quit, is the same quality that made it lethal. Modern diesel engines haven't eliminated the risk. Electronic fuel injection and computer-controlled governors have made some internal causes less likely. The precision of modern fuel metering systems means that a stuck mechanical fuel rack, a common cause of runaway in older engines, is essentially a thing of the past. Electronic sensors can detect overspeed conditions and shut down the fuel supply faster than any mechanical governor could. But none of that matters if the fuel source is external. A modern diesel with every electronic safeguard available will still run away if it starts ingesting flammable vapor from the surrounding air. The computer can cut the injectors to zero, and the engine will keep right on burning whatever is coming through the intake. The fundamental vulnerability is baked into the physics. As long as a diesel engine compresses air hot enough to ignite fuel on contact, and as long as it draws that air from its surroundings, it will always be capable of running away. And that's why positive air shutoff remains the last line of defense. Not electronics, not fuel management, air control. The only way to kill a runaway diesel is to suffocate it. Every other approach is just turning off a fuel supply the engine already abandoned. The people who maintain diesel equipment in hazardous environments understand this at a level that goes beyond training manuals. They check the shutoff valves the way a pilot checks the emergency exits. Not because they expect to use them today, but because the day they're needed, there won't be time to wonder whether they work. On a well-run site, those valves get tested regularly. The mounting hardware gets inspected. The sensors get calibrated. Because everyone on that crew knows the history. They know about Rosharon. They know about Texas City. They know about Deepwater Horizon. And they know that in every one of those disasters, a relatively inexpensive safety device properly installed and properly maintained might have broken the chain of events before it reached the ignition point. The diesel engine will keep running. That's what it does. That's what Rudolf Diesel designed it to do over 130 years ago. It's the same engine that hauls freight across continents, powers generators in hospitals during blackouts, drives ships across oceans, and keeps drilling rigs operating in conditions that would stop any other machine. Its willingness to keep running is its greatest gift. And on the day the wrong vapor finds the wrong intake, that same willingness becomes the thing that can't be stopped. If you've ever been near a diesel that ran away, whether it was a pickup in a parking lot or a generator on a rig floor, you know the sound. That rising, uncontrollable scream that tells you the machine has crossed a line that no key and no button can pull it back from. If you've got a story about one, whether you stopped it or watched it destroy itself or just heard about it from the guy in the next bay, drop it in the comments. And if you've ever checked a shutoff valve before driving onto a site and wondered if it was worth the 30 seconds, now you know what those 30 seconds are buying. If you're new to this channel, hit subscribe. We've got more stories like this one coming, and they're worth sticking around for.